Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Broken Slippers. I'm your host, Lily Holman, and as always, we are covering the unsuccessful Disney movies of the past 25 years in order to expose the talent and genius behind the more successful Disney films. We can also try to find the diamonds in the rough to try and figure out which ones are still worth celebrating. Um, so this week, I have to admit that I'm both nervous and excited about this episode because while the previous four have been pretty uncontroversial choices, today's film is actually considered a pretty beloved Disney classic, including the fact that I have many friends who might even categorize it as their favorite, at least in the Disney princess films. So the reason I'm covering it at all goes back to the criteria I outlined in episode 2, where I tried to quantify an unsuccessful Disney film as any film that made less than $100 million or has less than a B on Rotten Tomatoes. And this particular film fails the latter criteria in the sense that it has a 56% on Rotten Tomatoes and is specifically called out for its, quote, lack of fun. So I thought that using this formula would cover the black cauldrons of the world and pretty safely root out the Little Mermaids and the Beauty and the Beast. But I found out that even crowns can be tarnished, and just because you can meet a character in the park or see a clip in the fireworks show does not mean the critics gave it a gold star. And also does not mean that the audiences gave it a gold star. Therefore, if you have not guessed it by now, today's film is 1995's Pocahontas, directed by Eric Goldberg and Mike Gabriel. So, on paper, Pocahontas should work. While it is not based on a fairy tale, it is based on an American myth, which includes romance, dramatic conflict, and the opportunity to animate the country's natural beauty. It's also the first instance of an active Disney princess who actually participates in the climax that solves the conflict. And if you're thinking, hey, Pocahontas is the daughter of the chief, not a princess, well, hi, fellow Disney geek, but also she was coronated as a Disney princess, and therefore I consider her part of the canon. Personality-wise, she has the same rebellious spirit as Ariel, Belle, and Jasmine, and her love interest is a hunky young man named John Smith and voiced by Mel Gibson. And while that is not quite seen as an advantage now, in 1995, he was the star power behind this film. Meanwhile, the film is a musical, and while this is past the days of Howard Ashman and therefore at a fundamental disadvantage in my mind, they do bring in Stephen Schwartz, lyricist of Godspell Pippin and later on Wicked, so therefore they are not at a loss for amazing genius audiences not end up liking it, or at least end up not liking it as much as the almost billion-dollar grossing Lion King. Well, it's all rooted in the Disney musical formula, which we are now going to cover extensively. So, formulas are not inherently bad, as tempting as it is to damn them. They give creatives a strong foundation to build off of, and successful formulas survive because they have an impact on our psyche and our emotions, and simply they push our buttons in just the right ways. It's how we get drawn into a narrative we know is inherently fictional. The Disney Renaissance formula is pretty straightforward. You start off with a fairy tale or a myth, or in the case of Lion King, Hamlet, basically any familiar narrative, and you can do a spin on it, like animal protagonist or speaking furniture, but that's not 100% required. If you look at something like Aladdin, it's a pretty straightforward retelling. So your protagonist, male or female, should have a coming-of-age story, and there should be a charismatic villain whose path to power should be thwarted or threatened by our protagonist. I just realized I called Aladdin a straightforward retelling. Obviously, it has its own spins, but there's no, fundamental clever concepts to it, so in video correction. So that's the narrative spine, and then there's a fundamental musical on top of it that has a pattern as well. So it starts with what is essentially a village song to set the scene. So the village song can be pretty straightforward, something like Belle or Circle of Life, but it also can be less direct, so something like Daughters of Triton. All it really has to do is introduce us to the universe that we're about to enter. My personal favorite is actually the opener to Frozen, which happens many, many years later with the Iceman working in Arendelle. It doesn't really come up again, but it definitely introduces the world we are entering. So that's actually followed by what is the now famously called I Want song. It's usually associated with princesses, so something like Part of Your World or the reprise of Belle. But it can also be associated with the male protagonist, something like I Just Can't Wait to Be King, and even parts of One Jump Ahead, which is in Aladdin. So anything that introduces our protagonist and their goals are usually rooted in escaping the village or universe that was just established in the villain song. So after that, we get the comedic side character's big number, which can introduce him or her, so something like Friend Like Me, and can also celebrate the status quo in a positive way, like in Under the Sea or Hakuna Matata. It's then followed by a villain song, which can also be comedic, but should also be menacing, so something like Poor Unfortunate Souls or Be Prepared. So the last big number is a love song, like Kiss the Girl or Part of Your World. It's just not Part of Your World, I Can Show You the World. Basically the Aladdin carpet song, you know what I'm talking about. So it's basically the love song that introduces the male and female protagonist as a couple, and also is usually the song that they fall in love during. So the last number is usually a smaller number during the climax, something like the mob song, and the latter is not 100% necessary and is usually replaced with the score instead. So this is the Disney Renaissance formula. This is based off of Little Mermaid through Pocahontas, which is what we're talking about today. That's why I was oddly specific about some of them. That's why they're straight couples. So that's the basic formula we're working from. Obviously, it is up to being changed, and you can see variations of it already, but that's what we're working from. So with that in mind, let's take score. If we put Pocahontas up next to this formula, how does it follow the formula and how does it deviate? So first of all, it has two village songs. One is Virginia Company, which introduces the men on the ship coming from England, and one that introduces Pocahontas' village, Steady as the Beating Drum. While this is technically a deviation, it makes a lot of sense for the narrative, seeing as this is about the ill-fated coming together of two different communities, one far less welcome than the other. That is followed by the now pretty iconic I Want song, which is I Just Around the River Bend, which introduces Pocahontas and her desire to pursue adventure rather than marrying the very serious Coquam. So after that, we get Grandmother Willow's song, which is called Listen to Your Heart. And while Grandmother Willow is pretty snarky, she's not actually the comedic relief. And this is actually instead a previously uncategorized guidance song. So while we haven't seen this before Pocahontas, if you think of something like Grandma Tala's interlude or Moana, or the more comedic Dig a Little Deeper from Princess and the Frog, it is something that will become part of the formula later on. In this case, however, it is a little less memorable, mostly because it's mostly instrumental. After that, we get Governor Radcliffe's villain song, gracefully titled Mine, 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 and is far more fun if you think of it sung by the seagulls from Finding Nemo. In the middle, everyone gets to take a deep breath and stop and admire the love song Colors of the Wind, and it gives you a chance to pretend like John Smith and Pocahontas have chemistry. Not my favorite Disney couple. The last song you get is a fight song called Savages, Savages, which is based off of the title and the context, quite disturbing, but we're going to talk a little bit about that in a little bit. So hold off on the fight song for now. The main point we're leading up to here by going into extensive detail about the Disney formula and then going into basically a list of the soundtrack from Pocahontas is that when you line up these things, you realize the big thing that is missing is a major comedic side character or number. Like I said, Grandma Tala may be snarky, but it's not a comedic number that she gets in the film. And you do have funny side characters, Miko and Flit, but they are both silent. So there's no Under the Sea, Be Our Guest, Friend Like Me, or Hakuna Matata. So instead, like I said, we get the slow Listen with Your Heart, and the animators do get a chance to play with something like Colors in the Wind, but we don't really get a chance to breathe and laugh and really celebrate because all the numbers basically end up having a serious air to them that can be difficult to get fully lost in. which is kind of funny, seeing as Pocahontas' big criticism of her potential husband is that he's too serious. The entire film ends up being a bit too serious, and it comes across as an impressive nature or history documentary instead of a Busby Berkeley musical or a Disney Renaissance musical in the end. And while there's nothing wrong with that, it means that we're being sold a different movie than we are given. And because of that, again, still not a fundamental issue, but it means that we come in with different expectations. And therefore, with that one song out of step, the entire tone of the production shifts and ultimately loses out to the minds of the fans who have just seen and celebrated more perfect executions of this system. So, the other bizarre element that plays into this is the fact that I am calling out Pocahontas for a lack of fun, that lack of fun that Rotten Tomato refers to. And that means I'm essentially calling out a movie that is about a genocidal invasion for not being funnier, which I realize is fundamentally wrong. And that really shouldn't be the case, and therefore exposes the flaw of taking on the Pocahontas narrative in the first place. As was stated in previous videos, I'm all for raising the stakes of a Disney narrative, but when you do that, you have to do so delicately and carefully. And the myth of Pocahontas, and the myth that is adapted into this movie, puts a Romeo and Juliet spin on a story that really should instead focus on the atrocity of the actions by the British. It also forces us to root for a relationship between Pocahontas and John Smith mere minutes after he'd been advocating for the slaughter of her people. So we're basically asking to forget, we're being asked to forgive John Smith when he really doesn't deserve forgiveness. And while in the end Pocahontas puts a pacifist spin on it, and that's admirable, it's not really her entire goal of the film. And we can't even call out Pocahontas for totally whitewashing the issues, because a number like Savages, Savages does actually expose the truly terrible intentions of the villain and the rest of the Virginia Company. And all we're really given is that Pocahontas has a pacifist intention at the very end, but only at the very end, and she taught John Smith to be a better person, but that's not really 100% convincing. So what this really proves to me is that the Disney musical is just not an ideal format for heavy material. It's just a different beast. And it therefore exposes the limits of the Disney formula in a way that harms it as opposed to celebrates it. So, in the end, if Pocahontas is your favorite movie, or at least your favorite character, it's not quite surprising to me, because she herself is quite a compelling character, and it's exciting to see them the princesses get more and more active. The sidekicks are very cute, and Colors of the Wind and Just Around the Riverbend are truly great songs, but I think if you end up returning to the film as a whole, you won't be surprised that the critics' response was less than warm. And you can also realize why they might end up celebrating the character and the songs more than the movie itself. So it's almost there, but it takes risks that it cannot pull off. But it does, like most Disney failures, expose the miraculous nature of having such a successful string of films that came before it, and also proves just how well executed those movies are. So there, we did it. We covered Pocahontas. Whew, done. The next film will be less controversial, I hope, and I still hope you enjoyed it, and are not forming a mob a la Beauty and the Beast to come slay the beast, i.e. me. And otherwise, I hope you have a lovely and magical week, and come back and join me next week.